All right, we are blessed to have Ralph Moore with us today. He's going to spend some time with us talking about embedding multiplication DNA in our church culture, which I think, it doesn't matter what your church style or vibe is or your role in your church. This is going to be gold. So off to you, Ralph.
Wow. That's a big subject. As we get started thinking about multiplication, one of the I'm a bit of a reactionary person, and I have some real deep-seated values that come from Scripture. I started this journey when I was about 19 years old. I grew up in I'm not sure. It used to be the Portland Foursquare Church, just off of Burnside Street. It was at the time the biggest church in Oregon. Frustrated, saw a lot of hypocrisy, but we were big and we were significant. And I went to Bible college, and there were, in the hymnal, the church hymnal, there was this picture of the mother church of the denomination with 6,000 people there. I got there and there's like 400 depressed old folks. And I just like, this is horrible. And then I bumped into a professor who, we had some problems with this guy. I mean, he was kind of saying things to women that he shouldn't say. And one day he popped off and told us why we should never, ever, ever ask anyone to leave a church. There's no justification for this whatsoever. And Paul gives us 5 good reasons in 1 Corinthians. And so it's like, well, you don't know anything. And I'm 19 years old and I know everything. And so I dove into the book of Acts, and I was going to show these people how to go out and do Acts chapter 2 all over again. And I actually read it 5 times a week, the whole thing, at least minimum, for my second year in a Bible college. And I came away with a couple of thoughts. One is that the church in its infancy was huge, and it stayed in one location. As it matured, it dispersed. And of course, there was the Acts 8:1 moment that caused the dispersal. And, COVID may have turned into a mini Acts 8:1 moment for us, as perhaps did the election and the leaning to the left in America. And we've gone from a country that doesn't really care too much about what we have to say to one that is becoming more antagonistic toward what we have to say. So all of that, began to percolate in my mind. And then I got involved with some people who had planted churches in the Philippines and had just explosive growth. And then we stumbled into planting churches. And as we did, it was at the height of the revival that everybody called the Jesus movement. And there was a sort of purity in all of that. And, we were all about, we worship and we get in the Word. That was, the whole deal. We pray. And then coming out of that, I can remember in about 1975, 76, it all began to change. And I started to see a generation of people like just 5, 6, 7 years younger than me moving into leadership in these churches. And everything went from hippie to yuppie. And everything got super organized, and they begin to equate perfection in presentation with excellence. We looked at excellence as we reproduced ourselves in other people, and lives are being changed. That is excellence, and it comes with a lot of stumble, bumble, a lot of breakage, a lot of tears, a lot of grief. But then I saw, in the vernacular of the 70s, I saw church becoming what we would have called plastic rather than organic. And I reacted pretty hard against that. I was involved already. We were planting churches. By 1983, I was the 30th guy to leave the church that I'd planted to go start a new one. We had a well-constructed disciple-making continuum that also rolled over into a leadership training continuum. Very simple, very easy to reproduce, and anywhere in the world that you wanted to, without much money. And so I was beginning to get called on to do kind of what we're doing today, but at big denominational events. And I was one of the headliners in Japan and everything. And then maybe I overreacted, but I saw people putting vision before value. If I have anything to say today about creating a culture, is that you start with values. And as soon as vision supplants values, then kind of anything goes. The church today for the last 40 years has been discipled by the world rather than the world being discipled by the church, because we took our cues from what they're doing rather than our cues from what we're supposed to be doing that we see in Scripture in the New Testament. And so, to me, embedding multiplication DNA into a culture of a church really begins with the pastor and his heart, and to me, preaching. Everything that we did, it's very much like what Tim was just describing. It starts with the pulpit. It starts with what you're teaching on Sunday, and I was a teacher, not a preacher. And so we would just go through scriptures, kind of a chapter at a time, and probably about every 7 years go through the book of Acts and the gospel, and just keep inculcating our people with these values of making disciples that can reach the ethne, making disciples that can reach the people groups in our culture, in our expanded culture. And then, of course, that got reflected in what we're doing in the home groups. And then the next thing that you do is you begin to count costs and start to add structure and staffing and budget, and you focus it all on multiplication. And so to me, I wish we had 3 hours and we could just get down and talk about nuts and bolts. But as I look at the surface of all of this, I think it has to come back to what do you truly value? And what you truly value is where you spend your money and where you spend your time. I've always felt, and again, sometimes I probably can frustrate people, but I think if the lead pastor isn't making disciples of the people closest to him, discipling them, the church will never, ever achieve multiplication. To me, my primary job as a pastor was discipling my staff. My number two thing in my job description was putting out good content on the weekend that my staff and the people that they worked with, because we were kind of a hierarchy of, leaders, gathering groups of leaders who are gathering people, that we were feeding into that thing. But that was second. The first thing was that I had to make sure that the team was all going the same direction. And, if you would, disciple making is a form of brainwashing. And I just see that in Jesus. He's hanging out with these people all the time. They had to have a shared life. And if you don't have that shared life with your staff, this is why bad things happen in churches, and staff members feel used and abused and sometimes come off the rails. Anyway, I'm open for a little feedback at this point.
Well, I love the quote, discipleship is a form of brainwashing. That's awesome. Any questions or feedback from you guys on this so far?
Well, I was just, that quote that I read earlier. So Steve Pike just wrote this book called Next Wave. It's a good read. It's a great read on post-COVID church. And he really drills into this idea of values. And he talks about kind of like what you count, you celebrate, and what you celebrate becomes really your value and your vision, right? And so he talks about shifting the metrics, which I love what you're talking about, Ralph, the way that you pioneered that and kept the focus on that value. The metric, what I wrote down here was plastic versus organic, perfection and presentation. If that's the excellence thing that you're shooting for, it takes you in one direction. But if you're shooting towards multiplication and movement, it stays at that organic level of value. And that's the thing that you're measuring. It's the thing that you're celebrating. It's the thing you're spending money on. Like you said, what you value, you spend your resources on. So I just, really resonated with me. Thank you.
I work with an organization called Exponential, and the whole idea behind exponential.org is that we have the wrong scorecard in place. The idea with Exponential is 5 levels of church. Level 1 is shrinking. Level 2 is paying the bills and complacent. Level 3 is you're adding, and you have to add if you want to multiply. You make disciples one at a time. That's an addition process. Level 4 is we're reproducing, which for most people is going to be cloning, and it kind of operates like a church program. Level 5 is where autonomy comes into play, and we're reproducing churches that are free to reproduce without asking permission. But people get stuck on level 3, and so the scorecard begins to be, how many dollars in the offering, how many people in the chairs, whatever. For me, the scorecard was we were always measuring. In fact, if it didn't come into performance reviews with staff, it wasn't truly the scorecard. And so we were looking at how many what we called mini churches, home groups. How many mini churches in your purview? How many apprentice leaders in mini churches in your purview? And how many people are on deck to start a new mini church? Those are the big metrics for us. The other stuff's just going to happen. We're going to have more people in church. At the Zenith, we're doing 7 public services a weekend just to house everybody. And that's just going to happen if you do the other thing really well. And so it's really what you identified. It's those things that we value, that we measure, that we tell stories about, the heroes that we make. Those narratives then tend to beget new behaviors, and we go from there.
Ralph, I'd love to hear more about, you said your number one job description was to disciple your staff. Like what did that look like for you, and how can you help us to get our hands around how we might go about doing that?
Well, this kind of stems back to we had early, like 1976. We're about 5 years old as a church. We were meeting in like 6 or 7 buildings up and down a boulevard. We had a little tiny church building. We're renting a park. We're renting all kind of things, and then we bought this big bowling alley. It was like little over an acre under roof, and then an acre of parking, which wasn't enough. And we were just a bunch of dumb hippies. People would come to our church because they hear about growth, and people were getting delivered from drugs. There's some pretty powerful things that happen. And so then we moved to this, very prominent intersection in Los Angeles County, a building overlooking the ocean. It was a primo deal. And that first Sunday there, we doubled in attendance. And suddenly a parking lot that's full of old Volkswagens and surf fans is got a Rolls Royce and a bunch of Mercedes sitting there. And, part of my value deal is I made it my religion to not know who owned those cars. We're just not going to stop being who we are because of you. But staff guys start showing up in suits, and it was horrible. We just lost our identity. And about 4 weeks later, we'd gone from 400 people to 800, and then we shrank in 4 to 6 weeks down to about 600 people, and we were shrinking further. And so we got together on a weekend, and it had to be God. We came up with this thing we called mini church. And so we juxtaposed whatever I was teaching on the weekend or whoever was teaching with what's going on in the home group. And our thought was pretty educational, that people will remember twice as much of what they do remember if they talk about it within 7 days. And so that was our thing. We began to develop a model. In that model, as it evolved, we found out that people really grow from shared experience. If they're an affinity group, they love each other. There's something that happens, and character begins to change. Peer group pressure, really, if you think about it. And so we changed it to, we'd ask 3 questions. What did the Holy Spirit say to you while whoever was preaching? Because it may be different than what they said. The second question was, what are you going to do about it? Because once people voice that, they become accountable to themselves. A third thing, really begin to cause spiritual gifts to emerge. We were kind of surprised. The third question was, what can we do to help you? And as people get in the act, then it's not a churchy thing anymore, spiritual gifts. It's not, whatever you do in the parking lot, flagging cars into parking spaces. Your spiritual gifts begin to be something that just comes out of your life as you share life with another believer. And so as we developed this, I got involved with a guy in Honolulu who had a deep navigator's background, and I did also. And he had this book that he invented, and he would gather people together, and you read a chapter of the book, and then you come and you talk. And basically what he was doing off the book is what we were doing in our mini church situation. And so I attended his deal like twice, and I realized you could curriculize anything. This guy wrote his book. I don't need his book. And so I pulled my staff together around a book on the life of Hudson Taylor. And we just kind of went on from there. We started reading books together, Winston Churchill's life, leadership stuff, but a lot of Christian stuff. What I tend to stay away from is the hottest new Christian thing that came down the pipe. I'll read it 5 years later because I want to know if it had legs and endured. But sometimes we're reading business books together, but always we're coming to these same three questions. What did the Holy Spirit say to you? What are you going to do about it? And then how can we help you? And that feeds directly into multiplication. When you're starting that process with your staff, and then they're meeting with 5 to 8 mini church pastors, each staff member, and we're in a church of a couple thousand people, and we have like 150 home groups going on, and all the home group leaders are meeting with staff people who are meeting, we're together every Tuesday, and we'll spend, our staff meetings would look like 3.5 to 4 hours, but 2 to 2.5 hours of that would be the disciple making part of it, and the business part was brief. It just kept us all going in the same direction, and that direction was multiplication. Most of our, really successful multipliers who've come out of the Hope Chapels that I led were people who made it into staff, and they sucked up more of it along the way than anybody else. So.
One of the things, well, I'd love to hear any other questions because we can kind of freeform. And Ralph, you seem comfortable with that. So if anybody else has questions, we'd love to hear them.
I was at something, Ralph, that you spoke at. I think it was Exponential some years back, and I remember hearing that kind of. I think you used the term lowering the threshold into leadership, yeah. and that it was based largely on like Sunday mornings, Bible driven, kind of like you just described, and then going through books together. Outside of that, and it just piqued my alert because I overcomplicate things, and that just sounded so simple to me. And I love the idea of lower threshold into leadership, but I was also kind of wondering, how do you provide the accountability to those new leaders to know that you're not going in improper directions or heretical teaching or whatever?
Well, let me kind of break that into two. When I say lowering the threshold into leadership, take a children's church deal. And hardest thing in the world. I used to be a Christian education director in a small church in California, and somebody would call in Sunday morning. I'm not going to make it, and so I'm running around just before Sunday school starts, trying to grab somebody, hand a book to them, and go, "Can you go in there and teach these junior high boys?" And you got like 12 minutes to study up on it. And as we got going in Hope Chapel, we realized if we would take that same job and turn it into 4, this is how we lowered the threshold. So you got the top of the heap is the guy who presents the lesson. The next person comes in with a craft every week. The person after that, their job is, if you got an unruly child, he probably had a rough week, you just buddy up to him and maybe take him out in the hall or go for a walk with him, whatever. But you're supposed to begin to disciple this kid. And then the bottom of the pyramid was, can we recruit you to hand out juice and cookies in this children's church deal that we're doing? So what happens is, as the top guy moves on to do something else, everybody else just moves up a level. So we took that same thing and we took every job in the church and we tried to cut it into 4 jobs if we could. We couldn't always, but we would try to. So that the entry level was just, come on, help somebody. And so inside of a mini church, same deal. You're in the group already. So that's level 1. We see leadership in you. That's level 2. We ask you to come along and help us, and we do a rotating leadership deal. And so everything is really, I mean, you're under scrutiny while you're doing this, so you can't escape scrutiny. We're not trying for scrutiny, but everybody's there watching you, so you're not going to get too far out of line. And then the second part of your question, how do we protect against these leaders, against heresy and whatever? I would say that the Hope Chapels have got a far lower heresy quotient than the seminaries of America. For one, it comes back to me equating disciple making to brainwashing. You came to Jesus. Instantly. We tended to not put people through a 4-week new Christians class. We threw you into a mini church where there's a lot of love and acceptance, and you're putting your life on the line. We've seen character change, but the content is coming out of the Bible on Sunday morning, and then you're grinding it into your life in the process of being together. People pretty well, we had them by the time that they would walk out the door to plant a church. I recall one guy in the first church that I pastored, and he was into the prosperity doctrine really heavy, and I'm not. Although I have a certain kind of admiration for those people, and in some ways they do faith better than I do, and I can see why that is so popular in impoverished cultures. I'm working with a lot of African Americans in inner cities, and I get it. I don't buy it, but I get it. But this guy was hostile, and he'd sit in church and he'd have his Bible open, and he'd be elbowing his wife and pointing to, flipping the pages of his Bible while I'm up there talking. And it was really obvious. And this went on for months. I'm a pretty tolerant person. And finally, we kind of had this will sound silly, but this was part of our culture. We had a rule: no church splits. We're not allowing church splits. And how did we go about that? Well, this is an example. I went to the guy's name was Bruce. I go, Bruce, it's just obvious that you and I are just not going in the same direction. And I'd see you look painful every week. You look angry in church. So here's the deal. We'll give you our name. We'll give you money. And we'll give you all the people in this church that follow you and anybody else that wants to go with them if you're willing to start a church. We'll do everything we can to help you start a church. And rather than have a church split and lose 35 or 40 people, we did a church plant and sent about 50 people out. Well, this was just before I moved to Hawaii. I get back from Hawaii on a trip, and I bump into this guy, Bruce, and he comes up to me and he's got tears in his eyes, starts crying. And he was bivocational, by the way. He was an aerospace engineer. And he goes, "You got me." And I go, "What do you mean I got you?" His voice is breaking. "You got me." He goes, "Well, I held the doctrine that I held. I thought you were all wrong, but I imitated you. I went out the door and I started teaching the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And the doctrine that I held to wouldn't stand up to it. You got me." And so that we've had those kinds of experiences over the years. I'm probably viewed as a dinosaur because I just try to not do topical messages. I just want to go, and I don't go real deep. I'm not real exegetical. I kind of want to jump across the mountaintops, but I'm textual. The text tells me what I'm going to teach rather than me coming at the Bible, figuring out how can I teach this with, give me some verses. And but that has really kind of held us together as a movement, and it's held people to sound doctrine.
I think that guy goes to my church, and I've never thought of doing that with him. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying to Gabe. I said, my dad's name is Bruce, and he did live in Southern California in the 70s. But when you got to aerospace engineer, I was like, no, that's not. He's just a pastor.
That's funny.
Ralph, I mean, some of the stuff you're sharing, I think if we were just listening on a surface level, we might go, that must have worked great back then, honestly. But what we know of the Hope Chapel movement is that it's never stopped multiplying, and so I would love to hear a little bit about how you see that movement kind of transcending time in that sense, because, having listened enough now, it feels like, and if you guys haven't read Ralph's book, Let Go of the Ring, it's fantastic. And I think there's a lot of these principles in there. But tell us a little bit about how you see it moving forward, even into now.
I'm quite frustrated. I see it growing on the fringes. The big rap that Ed Stetzer put out, and then everybody talks about, is that we started all these churches and that we'd have to organize ourselves to stop church planting. Well, actually, at the center, church planting has slowed down significantly since I retired, and I'm very frustrated with that. I was in a conversation with a guy that I disciple. He's in another movement, but they've planted a number of churches, and then they swung over to doing the multi-site deal, but they do it with a twist. Their goal is for each of those sites to become their own church, and they're doing that. And so I asked him this question, and I expected him to say that it was him. Well, I was in Hawaii. When I moved to Hawaii, the U.S. Census said 4% of the population are either Catholic, in this order: Catholic, Protestant, Mormon, or Jehovah's Witness, and they called them Christians. We felt that God called us to go and add 1% to that, so the church would grow by 25% in 10 years, and that would be 10,000 people at that time. It was just 1 million in Hawaii. What happened was we kind of touched off a church planting movement. We started maybe 60, 62, 63 churches during the time I was in Hawaii as a movement. And but by the time that I left Hawaii, by 2006, actually long before I left Hawaii, from 83 to 2006, the Barna Group did a study that a bunch of us paid for. And they said that 67% of the state now, in a survey, called themselves either Protestant or Protestants or Catholic. They didn't count the others. And so what happened was that myself and Wayne Cordero, who you probably know from Oregon, were both we're at the epicenter of this thing. We're different in style, but both of us, and in fact, almost church for church in Hawaii, the numbers matched. Their churches tended to be bigger than ours, and they didn't do this stuff around the world that we did, but it was church for church. And so now Wayne is semi-retired. He still comes back to Hawaii. I go back like once a year when there's not COVID. And so I asked this guy, Norman Nakanishi, who's the locus? Who's the center of church multiplication in Hawaii now that Wayne and I backed away? And I thought he was going to say I am. And he said, well, actually, no one is. We need you to come back and stir things up. And so while I can point you to places in Latin America or Africa, or now Japan is starting to, I've been to Japan about 85 times. And I just, I guess 13 days ago, did a 4-hour seminar in Tokyo, and we're starting to see momentum building in these places. At the core of it, it's slowed down. Hope Chapel Hermosa went on and planted churches. They got churches in Israel, Madagascar. Madagascar is like 200 churches. It's crazy. They're doing some incredible things, but the guy Zach who took my place is my age, and I've retired. He's still there, and they're kind of going through the succession thing. That's slowing them down a little bit. And so I think that the lesson out of that, I wish I could tell you things are just ripping, but the lesson is that there has to be a Moses somewhere in the center of this thing, and we're not going to walk out of the wilderness. And every one of you guys listening, you need to kind of see yourself as that Moses or as that Barnabas. I always used to ask people, if you could be anybody in the Bible who you wanted to be, who would that be? Women and men would say, I'd want to be King David because he wrote the Psalms. Well, yeah, but he killed his neighbor over his wife. I want to be Barnabas. Barnabas dug Saul out of the woodwork. Barnabas splits with Saul over John Mark. John Mark goes places, incredible things happen. Saul has to eat his words down the road and say that Mark is valuable to me. Barnabas is the instigator. And I think that every movement has to have an instigator. And, it's one thing to call it a Moses, because that sounds like top down. It's I think better to call it a Barnabas, because that kind of works bottom up. And I think that's how we have to roll.
That's fantastic. I'd love to hear you just speak to, before we move into some multiplication next steps, I'd love to hear you talk about what you currently see, where you currently see opportunities for church planting that maybe are new.
Jesus said to make disciples of all ethne. It wasn't nation states. It was groups. And, we get our word ethnicity. So we tend to think that when we hear the word ethne. Or then we'll take it a step further and we start to talk about language groups. And there's like 1,500 languages or something like that in the world. Los Angeles City schools, I think they're up to 254 languages that are spoken at home that come together and speak English in the school system. And yet I think it goes a lot further than that. And I think the future in terms of real aggressive, missionary-minded evangelism in our country is going to be with this microchurch thing. We planted churches. Our goal was always to start a church of between 150 to 300 people whenever we sent somebody out the door. And so we never really did the launch large thing, but we weren't into microchurch. And then about 4 years ago, I wrote a book for Exponential on microchurch, and it was really an assignment kind of rooted in my understanding of church. Let's go explore this thing. But it was really my friend Todd Wilson's brainchild. And so we kind of wrote it together. I did, a lot of it, but Todd steered a lot. It's a very good book. It's called Mega Multi Multiply. And they're changing it to Mega Multi Micro. Because the idea is the mega church was here for 40 years and didn't get the job done. Multi-site is topping out and actually caving in. And it's time to go to micro churches. And I see them as an opportunity to reach into different, I'm going to use the word affinity group, and let's equate that to ethnic. So your affinity group could be your cousins. It could be all the people who are the same race as you. But your affinity group could be the bikers that you hang out with on the weekend, even though you're an attorney and your friend is an architect. There are these little people groups all over, and they become identity groups. They become functionally ethnic. And so in writing about this for Exponential, I dug out 8 microchurches that I knew of in the whole history of Hope Chapel. And told stories. One guy went to Lewiston, Idaho, and intentionally started a micro church, but it outgrew the micro. One guy, I was kind of famous in the jails in Honolulu. I was on the radio. Actually 3 times a day on 2 different stations, but one of those broadcasts was at 9:00 at night. So this would be 5 days a week. And the only people listening to AM radio at 9:00 at night are in jail. And guys would write me, I'd write them back. They'd come out of prison, they'd show up in our church one time, and then they'd leave. Because they didn't fit with this, we're very multi-ethnic, big 13-member worship bands. Nobody white is on the band. That was a prideful accomplishment for a white person living in Hawaii, pastoring a church. And we were so, we'd say we're all chop suey ethnically. But if you come out with prison tattoos all over your body, you don't fit in this nice middle-class church. So one of our guys went and started a microchurch for guys coming out of jail. And very quickly, they had 2 microchurches for guys coming out of jail. And so we've seen a lot of things like this. One of our guys moved to Las Vegas to open a martial arts studio. And he began to reach into the gaming world. He had, dancers, people that aren't going to make it into your typical, church looks like us kind of a group of people. And so I just wrote something on my blog. I run a little website, and I just did a blog and a YouTube video about the sad saga of unchurched Harry and Mary. That was a good, useful metaphor for a little while. But the problem was those two people look like you. If you're black, then unchurched Harry and Mary are black. If you're Asian, they're Asian. If you're white, they're white. Our churches tend to be homogenous. And I think that the next thing, and I think COVID is teaching us some wonderful lessons. I think we're going to see, and I'm a prophet of doom here, but I think we're going to see our culture turning more antagonistic to Christianity. And that some of the lessons of COVID are going to have to roll themselves over into something that looks like a house church that may not meet in houses. And I think that's where the next opportunity is. There's low cost, there's low risk. You can fly under the radar. Biggest costs in churches are seminary salaries and mortgages or rent. When you meet in a bar or you meet in a coffee shop or you meet in a park, you don't have any of that. You don't have to, we got land in Hawaii. It took 10 years to get a building permit, not even a building permit, a permit to scrub the land before we could start grading it, just to take the trees off of it. And I think that we're looking at a future that's going to dictate some of this, but also I don't see it as we're backing into it. I see it as an opportunity we should pursue, because the major benefit to what I call microchurch is that we can reach into ethne that we're not touching at all. And that's got to drive us. If we believe the gospel, we've got to care about people who aren't going to be attracted to whatever we're doing on Sunday morning.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thanks for all of that.